G'day folks, welcome to my channel. In this video, I want to talk about the story of the widow's mite that's found in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke. This is a story that many mega church pastors and really pastors in general use to try to justify the idea that you should give to the church even if it's your very last dollar. They put forward the story of the widow's mite as an example of sacrificial giving and encourage people to give even if it hurts, because this widow, after all, gave her very last 2 mites and it was everything that she had. They use this story as an example of giving, and I think that they wrongly use this story as an example of giving. And I want to show you that this story is actually used to condemn the religious leaders of Israel. It's used to condemn the Pharisees and the religious leaders of Israel. But before I get into this video, let me play you a clip just so that people don't try to say that I'm wrong and that no church pastor is saying this. I want to play you a clip by Robert Morris where he uses the exact story that I'm talking about. Here it is.
But let me show you one sacrificial offering, Mark chapter 12 now, if you're there, that you might not think about as a sacrificial offering. You might not have remembered it, but Mark 12 verses 41 through 44. Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury, that's the offering box, and saw how the people put money into the treasury. I just want you to notice that he was watching how they did it. He wasn't as concerned with how much. He was watching how. He's watching the attitude of the heart. And many who were rich put in much, and they should. Today, when you make a commitment, you should give according to your ability. It should be a sacrifice. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrans. Okay, a mite is a Jewish penny. 2 mites make a quadrans, which is a Roman penny. So that explains that, because we don't use mites and quadrans today. So she gave 2 Jewish pennies, which 2 Jewish pennies equal 1 Roman penny. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, "Assuredly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all she had, her whole livelihood." That's a sacrificial offering.
And let me play you another clip that Heidi Baker actually posted to her Facebook page. And in this clip, she's actually taking the widow's last mite and she posts it on Facebook. You can search for it, it's still there. She posts it on Facebook and titles it "The Widow's Last Mite." Check this out. Now, to me, that's absolutely shocking. The idea that this woman would take money from this poor woman who seems to have nothing, and the idea that she's set up this thing on the stage for people to come up and give money and make a show of their giving. To me, this is absolutely shocking. We should be giving money to these people, not the other way round. But I want to show you, without a shadow of a doubt, that the story of the widow's mite actually has nothing to do with Christian giving. The story of the widow's mite is being told to condemn the religious leaders and the Pharisees that were running the religious system in Jerusalem at the temple. Now, if you want a copy of my notes, send me an email. Those of you who sent me an email already for my tithing notes from my last video, there's no need for you to send me an email to get a copy of these notes. But those of you who didn't, and if you want a copy of my notes on the widow's last mite, send me an email to ithinkbiblically@gmail.com. Now let's get right into it. The story of the widow's mite comes really in the last week of Jesus' ministry, just before his crucifixion. And it comes when Jesus is giving his strongest condemnation upon the Pharisees. When you look at the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see that Jesus gives a strong condemnation upon the Pharisees, and then he prophesies the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Now, the story of the widow's mite is only in Mark and Luke, but it's squeezed in between his condemnation of the Pharisees for devouring widows' houses and his prophecy about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Matthew, although it doesn't contain the story of the widow's mite, gives an expanded, historical account of what happened during that period that Mark and Luke record when they tell us the story of the widow's last mite. And he pronounces 7 woes upon the Pharisees. Very, very strong condemnation in the Gospel of Matthew. But of course, Matthew doesn't record the story of the widow's mite, but Mark and Luke do when they are telling the same narrative at the same time as those 7 curses that Jesus pronounces upon the Pharisees. Now, let's look first of all at Mark chapter 12, verse 38 to 40. It says this: "He said to them in his teaching, 'Beware of the scribes who love to go about in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the prominent seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive greater condemnation.'" Now, this is a perfect description of the mega church pastor today. They love to be greeted in the marketplace. They might not wear long robes, but they certainly do wear designer clothing. They wear expensive jewelry, gold chains, diamonds. They have Rolex watches. These are people that have the finest of clothing. And these are the people that love to hear the praises of men. Just like the Pharisees, the mega church pastor loves to hear the praises of men. And it says here that in this passage that they devour widows' houses. This is the context of the passage so far. Let's keep reading the next verse in the Gospel of Mark. It says this. We're up to Mark chapter 12, verse 41. It says this: "Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury. Many who were rich put in much, but a certain widow came in and put in 2 mites, which make a farthing. He called his disciples to him and said to them, 'Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. They contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had, her entire livelihood.'" This is the verse that many megachurch pastors and really pastors in general point to as an example of Christian giving, sacrificial Christian giving, they argue. They argue that if this woman put in her very last 2 mites, everything she had, her entire livelihood, then how much more should we be willing to do the same? And they insist that if you're on government benefits, you should continue to give them money. Even if you can't put food on the table, you should continue to give them money. But that's not what this passage is about. Those that argue that ignore the context completely. Jesus isn't telling stories about giving and so forth. No, in the context, he's condemning the religious leaders of Israel. He's condemning the Pharisees for devouring widows' houses. That's the context of the passage. Jesus wouldn't in one breath condemn the Pharisees for devouring widows' houses and taking everything that they have, and then in the next breath say, "Oh, this is a wonderful example of giving," and encourage people to do it, and then therefore making religious leaders feel comfortable about taking the very last 2 mites, everything that a widow has and her entire livelihood. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. Dr. Craig Evans, who's one of evangelicals' leading New Testament scholars, an eminent scholar in the New Testament, has a commentary on the Gospel of Luke. And in his commentary, he says this within the context of course, we've been reading from Mark, but of course, Luke tells the story as well in the exact same context, I might add, as I've already pointed out. He says this in his commentary. Let me read it to you. He, referring to Jesus, saw in the episode an illustration of what he had said earlier in Luke chapter 20, verse 46 to 47. In other words, because of the teaching of the religious authorities of her day, The poor widow gives up her last penny and so is victimized for the sake of an oppressive religious system. Her wealth, or what little wealth there was devoured. See verse 47. Jesus' statement in 21 verse 4, therefore, is not one of praise, but one of lament. It may be because of this great economic injustice that Luke is satisfied to have this episode immediately precede Jesus' prediction of the temple's destruction. The story of the widow's mite is not an example of Christian giving. The story of the widow's mite is an example of the religious leaders and the Pharisees devouring widows' houses. Just like we see today with these mega church pastors and many churches and many pastors of small churches, just as they are devouring widows' houses, so too were these Pharisees devouring widows' houses. And Jesus pronounced judgment, and he prophesied the destruction of the Jerusalem temple because of all of the wickedness in Israel, especially here in this context, the story of the widow's mite. Even John MacArthur agrees with this.
You know, the prosperity gospel is more morally reprehensible than a Las Vegas casino because it masquerades as religion. They take your money in Las Vegas, but you expect it. Because it's run by the mafia. You don't expect the people that represent God to do the same thing. And when Jesus saw the widow put her last mite into the temple offering, he said, this temple is going to come down. Not one stone will be left on another. I don't know what you have been taught about that story of the widow giving her last 2 cents. That was not an example of Christian giving. God doesn't expect you to give your last 2 cents and go home and die. That's what happens to a widow who is suckered by a religion of works. She was trying to buy with her last 2 cents her way into the kingdom because that's what she'd been taught. And Jesus says any system that sucks people down to the place where they have nothing left in a false hope is coming down.
And what's interesting is this: under both the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, God's people are supposed to take care of widows. That's what the tithe was for in the Old Testament. The tithe, part of the tithe, was for the poor, the fatherless, and the widow. That's what the tithe was for. And in the New Testament, Paul admonishes God's people to take care of widows in the church. Widows shouldn't be giving, widows should be receiving. That is what the Bible teaches. Hope you've liked this video. If you have, please consider subscribing, give me a thumbs up, hit the bell notification button. I'll see you in the comment section and you'll see me in my next video.